Welcome to our newest episode about the French Revolution. Subscribe our channel and enjoy. The French Revolution was a period of profound social, political, and cultural upheaval that rocked France and much of Europe in the late 18th century. It began in 1789 with the calling of the Estates General, as the people of France demanded greater representation and an end to the injustices of the old regime. Over the course of the next decade, France would be transformed by revolution and war, as new ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy swept the nation. From the storming of the Bastille to the Reign of Terror and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the French Revolution was a defining moment in European history, leaving a lasting impact on the world that can still be felt today. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General was like a gathering storm on the horizon, with dark clouds of uncertainty and discontent gathering over France. The country was facing a financial crisis, and King Louis XVI knew that he needed help to weather the storm. So, he called for the Estates General, a meeting of representatives from the three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. On May 5, 1789, the representatives arrived at Versailles, each dressed in their finest clothes, as if ready to attend a grand ball. But this was no party. Instead, it was a tense gathering of people who knew that the fate of the country was at stake. As they sat in the grand hall, with its ornate decorations and gilded furnishings, the tension was palpable. The representatives of the common people, known as the Third Estate, were determined to push for change, while the nobility and clergy were more conservative and resistant to change. The discussions were heated, with arguments and counterarguments flying back and forth. The fate of the country hung in the balance, and everyone knew it. Little did they know that this meeting, called to address the financial crisis, would mark the beginning of a revolution that would shake France and the world to its core. The Estates General may have started as a mere attempt to address the financial crisis, but it would soon become the stage for one of the most significant events in modern history. June 17, 1789. It was a hot and muggy day in Paris, and tensions were running high. The representatives of the Third Estate, frustrated with the intransigence of the nobility and clergy, had decided to take matters into their own hands. As they filed into the Grand Hall, with its high ceilings and marble floors, they knew that they were making history. They were there to represent the common people, to fight for their rights and their dignity, and they were determined to succeed. The discussions were intense, with arguments and counterarguments flying back and forth. But finally, the representatives of the Third Estate had had enough. They stood up and declared themselves the National Assembly, the voice of the people. It was a dramatic moment, one that would send shockwaves through the country and the world. For centuries, the monarchy had held absolute power in France, and now the common people were seizing that power for themselves. As they left the hall, the representatives of the Third Estate could feel the weight of history on their shoulders. They knew that they were embarking on a journey that would be long and difficult, but they were ready for the challenge. They had declared themselves the National Assembly, and nothing would stop them now. July 14, 1789. The people of the city had been simmering with anger for months, frustrated by the monarchy's refusal to listen to their grievances. But on this day, everything changed. The crowd swarmed through the streets, shouting and waving banners. They were determined to make their voices heard, to demand change and justice. And as they reached the Bastille, a towering fortress that had long been a symbol of royal tyranny, they knew that this was their moment. The guards at the Bastille tried to hold them back, firing muskets and cannon into the crowd. But the people were not deterred. They surged forward, tearing down the gates and storming the fortress. It was a violent and chaotic scene, with the sounds of gunfire and the clash of steel ringing through the air. But the people were driven by a fierce determination to bring down the symbols of the old order and to seize power for themselves. As the smoke cleared, the people emerged victorious. The Bastille had fallen, and with it, the power of the monarchy had been dealt a fatal blow. The people had shown that they were not to be trifled with, that they would fight for their rights and their freedoms, no matter the cost. And so, on that hot and tumultuous day, the Bastille became the rallying cry for a revolution that would change the course of history. It was a moment of triumph and hope, a moment when the people had shown that they had the power to shape their own destiny. August 4, 1789. It was a historic day in Paris, a day when the National Assembly gathered to take bold action against the injustices of the past. The sun was shining down on the Grand Hall, its light filtering through the stained glass windows and casting a warm glow over the assembled representatives. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and anticipation. The people knew that they were about to witness something momentous, something that would change their lives forever. And then it happened. One after another, the representatives of the nobility and clergy rose to renounce their privileges and declare their support for the people's cause. They spoke of the need for equality and justice, of the importance of tearing down the old order and building a new society based on freedom and fairness. The air was electric with emotion as the representatives of the Third Estate cheered and applauded. They knew that they were witnessing a turning point in history, a moment when the power of the old order was being broken and a new era of freedom and equality was being born. As the day wore on, the National Assembly took bold action after bold action, abolishing feudalism and many other privileges of the nobility and clergy. The people could scarcely believe what they were hearing. For centuries, they had lived under the thumb of the aristocracy, oppressed and marginalized. But now, at last, their voices were being heard, and they were being given the chance to shape their own destiny. And so, on that hot and vibrant day in August, the National Assembly paved the way for a new era in French history. It was a day of hope and promise, a day when the people of France dared to dream of a brighter future. In October 1789, it was a cold and misty morning in Paris when the women began to gather. They were tired, hungry, and angry. For weeks, the price of bread had been rising steadily, and many families were struggling to make ends meet. But now, the women had had enough. They knew that the monarchy was spending vast sums of money on extravagant luxuries while they and their families went hungry. And so, with a fierce determination in their hearts, they set out on a march that would change the course of history. As they made their way through the countryside, their numbers swelled. Women of all ages and backgrounds joined the march, their voices raised in a powerful chorus of anger and frustration. They carried banners and flags, calling for an end to the monarchy's excesses and demanding bread for their families. And finally, they arrived at Versailles, the seat of the monarchy. The palace loomed before them, a symbol of the wealth and power that had been denied to them for so long. The women surged forward, breaking down the gates and pouring into the palace grounds. The king and his courtiers were taken by surprise, and they knew that they were powerless to stop the angry throng. For hours, the women raged through the palace, breaking furniture and smashing priceless works of art. They demanded that the king return with them to Paris, where he could see the suffering of the people for himself. And in the end, they got their wish. The king was forced to return to Paris with the crowd, humbled and defeated. The power of the people had triumphed over the power of the monarchy, and a new chapter in French history had begun. In June 1791, when King Louis XVI and his family set out from Paris, hoping to escape the turmoil that had engulfed the city. They traveled in disguise, their faces hidden behind heavy cloaks, their hearts heavy with fear. For days, they made their way through the countryside, moving quickly and quietly to avoid detection. But as they neared the border, their luck ran out. A group of soldiers, suspicious of the king's party, stopped them and demanded to see their papers. In the tense moments that followed, the king's identity was revealed, and the soldiers realized that they had caught a prize beyond their wildest dreams. The king and his family were brought back to Paris in chains, their heads held low in shame. The people of the city were outraged, seeing the king's attempt to flee as a betrayal of the revolution and a sign of his lack of faith in the new order. The event further undermined Louis XVI's already fragile authority, and strengthened the resolve of the revolutionaries. The people of France had come too far and sacrificed too much to let the monarchy slip away so easily. The streets of Paris were filled with angry crowds, demanding that the king be held accountable for his actions. The power of the people was palpable, and Louis XVI knew that his days on the throne were numbered. And so, as the summer turned to fall, the fate of the French monarchy hung in the balance. The revolution was gathering momentum, and the people of France were determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. On September 3, 1791, the air was electric with anticipation as the members of the National Assembly gathered to vote on the Constitution of 1791. For months, they had labored over the document, debating its provisions and refining its language. At last, the moment of truth had arrived. The fate of the French monarchy hung in the balance, and the eyes of the world were upon them. One by one, the delegates rose to cast their votes. The tension in the room was palpable, and the air was thick with the sense of history in the making. And then, at last, the final vote was tallied. The Constitution of 1791 had been adopted, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. The new constitution established a constitutional monarchy, with the king as the head of state but with limited powers. It also created a new legislative body, the Legislative Assembly, which would have the power to create laws and oversee the government. For the first time in French history, the power of the monarchy was curtailed, and the people had a greater say in their government. It was a moment of triumph for the revolutionaries, who had fought so hard for the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Constitution of 1791 would prove to be a pivotal moment in the history of France, laying the foundation for a new era of democratic government and social change. And as the delegates left the hall that day, they knew that they had played a part in shaping the destiny of their nation. On January 21, 1793, the skies were gray and foreboding on the day of King Louis XVI's trial. The mood in Paris was tense, as people from all walks of life crowded the streets to witness the historic event. Inside the courtroom, the king sat stoically, his fate in the hands of the revolutionaries who had brought him to trial for treason. The charges against him were serious, and the evidence against him was damning. But even as the trial unfolded, many still held out hope that the king would be spared. After all, he was still a symbol of the old order, and his death would signal a dramatic break with the past. And then, at last, the verdict was delivered. King Louis XVI was found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death by guillotine. The news sent shockwaves through Paris, and the people of France were left to grapple with the enormity of what had just happened. The monarchy, which had ruled the country for centuries, was no more. On the day of his execution, King Louis XVI was led to the scaffold, his head held high in defiance. He spoke his last words with dignity and composure, even as the blade fell and his life was cut short. And with that, the reign of the French monarchy came to a violent and dramatic end. The revolutionaries who had brought down the king had achieved what many had thought impossible, and France was left to chart a new course into an uncertain future. Later, the streets of Paris were awash with blood during the Reign of Terror, a dark and terrible period that plunged France into a state of chaos and fear. The revolution had taken a violent turn, as the government sought to stamp out opposition and consolidate its power. Committees were formed to root out traitors and enemies of the state, and anyone suspected of disloyalty was arrested, tried, and often executed. The guillotine became a symbol of the revolution, as thousands of people were beheaded in public executions. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the city was gripped by a sense of unease and dread. Those who had once championed the cause of liberty and equality now found themselves living in a state of constant terror, as the government turned on its own people in a bid to maintain control. The victims of the Reign of Terror came from all walks of life, from nobles and clergy to common people and revolutionaries themselves. No one was safe from the arbitrary hand of the government, and the streets ran red with the blood of the innocent. And yet, even in the midst of this darkness, there were those who continued to resist, who refused to be cowed by the violence and oppression. They stood up for what they believed in, even as they knew that their lives were at risk. For many, the Reign of Terror was a period of unspeakable horror, a time when the very principles of the revolution were twisted and distorted into something unrecognizable. And though it would eventually come to an end, its legacy would be felt for years to come. As the chaos of the revolution began to subside, France found itself struggling to establish a stable and effective government. The Directory, formed in 1795, was meant to be a new era of stability and progress for the country. But from the outset, it was plagued by problems. Political infighting, corruption, and economic crisis threatened to undermine its authority, and many wondered if it could survive. Meanwhile, military conflict continued to rage on France's borders, as neighboring countries sought to take advantage of its weakened state. The country was in a constant state of turmoil, with no end in sight. And then, in 1799, a new figure emerged on the scene. Napoleon Bonaparte, a young general with a fierce ambition and a talent for leadership, seized power in a coup and established himself as France's new ruler. Under his leadership, the country would once again find stability and security, as Napoleon brought an end to the political chaos and military conflict that had plagued France for so long. But even as the country enjoyed a newfound sense of stability under Napoleon's dictatorship, many wondered at what cost it had come. The ideals of the revolution had been replaced by the ambitions of a single man, and France's future remained uncertain. The French Revolution may have ended over 2 centuries ago, but its legacy lives on to this day. Its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity continue to inspire people around the world, while its political and social transformations helped shape the modern world. From the rise of nationalism and democracy to the development of modern warfare and the establishment of new systems of government, the French Revolution was a watershed moment in human history, one that continues to fascinate and inspire people to this day. Thank you for watching, subscribe our channel and see you in next episodes.